We are talking again with State Senator Bruce Tarr. Hi, Bruce. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you doing, Heather?
I'm good. Let's jump
Good.
right into this week's election. How do you think it all went?
Well, I am very heartened to see the kind of participation that we got in this election. It was a huge turnout, and that is inspiring to see people coming out to vote in all of the different ways that they were allowed to do so in this election. So, the numbers from the Secretary of State indicate that we had somewhere between 1.3 and 1.5 million people that voted. And you have to weigh that against the circumstances of the pandemic and all of the difficulties of social distancing and trying to get to the polls and having enough poll workers and all of those things taken together. So it proves once again how important participating in democracy is and how people in Massachusetts embrace that. And so I wrote down a few statistics, Heather, here, just looking back at past primaries. So in 2018, there were about 981,000 votes cast. And in 2016, there were about 386,000 votes cast. So what we saw with 1.3 to 1.5 is really remarkable.
That's amazing. That is amazing. And we had talked earlier about the whole issue of mail-in ballots. So how do you think that process was, how was that tested?
Well, here's something interesting. Out of that 1.3 to 1.5 million people who voted, 1 million of them voted not on election day. In other words, either through early voting or by mail-in voting. And so that testifies to the importance of the tools that we added and expanded. And I think that generally things went pretty well. Now, we did hear from the clerks about the volume and the challenges that accompanied that volume. And obviously, there was a concern about having enough poll workers. That seemed to be addressed. But like anything, when you're doing things for the first time, it's a learning experience. And I think we'll go back and learn from what's happened in this primary and later in the general election. One of the things that I added to the bill relative to the new tools that we did was having random election audits so that when all of the process is over, we can go back and look and make sure that the process had integrity and that it was fair and equal. And those things are important. Now, there's been no suggestion that they haven't been present, that things haven't been fair or had integrity, but it's always important to be vigilant. And we'll go back and look and make sure. But I wonder if we hadn't expanded early voting, if we hadn't expanded mail-in voting, if we would have seen this kind of robust participation. Well, maybe we would have, but it certainly seems like those things helped to increase voter engagement and voter participation.
Yeah.
Now, Secretary Galvin over the last couple of days has signaled that he does have concern about the general election, primarily because of the volume that he is anticipating, and I think we're all anticipating. And so we're going to have to watch that very carefully. And the legislature and the governor are going to have to think about, as we lead up to that election, whether or not there are other things that we could do that might help the city and town clerks with what is going to be, we think, a monumental task.
So let's move on to Beacon Hill. People think you're on vacation, but we know you're not. Because there you are. So tell us what's going on there.
So I think it's important to remember that normally in the second year of the legislative session, which we're in right now, we would be in informal session only. But because of the pandemic, both the House and the Senate changed the rules and changed them in a way that allows us to continue to meet in formal sessions up until the next legislative session, which begins on the first Wednesday of the new year. So we're in a time that I've not seen before with that kind of blanket suspension of the rules. And essentially, there are 3 or 4 things that would compel us to have a formal session right now. One is the state budget, which we have not done yet. And we've talked about that before because we're waiting for more information, particularly from the federal government. The second would be if there are COVID-19 related things that require a formal session that we must do, we would certainly have a formal session for that. And the third thing is if we see the conference committees that are meeting on several different bills report a consensus bill out of the conference committee. And it's important to remember that right now there are a number of conference committees meeting. So while you don't see a lot of legislative sessions and you don't see a lot of activity in the chambers here on Beacon Hill, that isn't to say that there aren't very serious discussions taking place on a number of important subjects. So things like economic development, transportation, energy and climate change, police reform, healthcare. All of those subjects are being discussed in conference committees right now. And just to remind folks that conference committees occur when each branch passes its own version of a bill, and then 3 members of each branch are appointed to reconcile the differences in those bills and produce a final document, which is called a conference committee report. And what I was mentioning to you off camera, Heather, is that the conference committee report is a really important document because generally speaking, when they come back for acceptance or rejection by the House and the Senate, they are not amendable. And so members have to read through those documents and decide on balance, is that something that they want to vote for or they want to vote against? And so that can be a very challenging decision that's based on the contents of the consensus bill or the reconciled bill. So there's a lot going on right now. And I would suspect that within the next several weeks, we'll probably see some of those conference committee reports come to the floor of the House and the Senate.
And I understand that you're not allowed to report in at all while these are in conference committee, right?
So
Reported with us.
conference committees begin as public meetings. But what most often happens is a vote is taken by the conferees to move to executive session, at which time the process becomes closed. And therefore, members of conference committees cannot discuss what's happening in the committee's operations to anyone, and unfortunately, including members of the press.
Is there any COVID-connected legislation coming up that you will have to address?
Well, a lot of things that are related to COVID are actually in the bills that are in conference committee on the healthcare bills. And I think that we will be taking up some of those things. And I'll give you an example. One of the things that we're trying to do is make sure that telemedicine continues to be available, because we've seen just how valuable it is during the stress test in our healthcare system that's been produced by the pandemic. And so telemedicine, in my humble opinion, needs to continue. And both the House and the Senate have expressed that sentiment. And so that is a COVID-related thing that will come up, we're hoping, in a conference committee report. But there could well be other things. We hear a lot about the need for additional testing. We don't know what's going to happen with regard to vaccines. There could be the requirement for additional funding for personal protective equipment, particularly as schools reopen and we think about needing to keep people safe. So there could be any number of things that would need to come up in the formal session relative to COVID-19. Right now, there is nothing specifically on the agenda, but given the fluidity of the pandemic situation, it could well be that next week something could arise.
Well, if we can leave Beacon Hill for a little bit, I would like to talk about the census, because the census is so critical right now, and it's getting down to the deadline. So do you want to talk about why it's important and what's going on there?
Absolutely, and a couple of things. One, a lot of us were concerned when the time period was shortened for the collection of census data, making it even more important that we all do everything we can to respond to the census. And in terms of its importance, there are two principal things that I think stand out. One is that census data is used to apportion federal funding. And that is a critical thing for our state budget to be able to have appropriate federal revenues and federal resources to be able to conduct the missions of state government. And so getting a good census count is important, and making sure everyone gets counted. The second thing that's important is that we base our legislative districts on census data. And so getting an accurate count not only ensures that we have fair representation in the United States House and the United States, in the United States House to make sure that we get the apportionment right. But it also impacts every single legislative district at the state level. So the Massachusetts House of Representatives, the Massachusetts Senate, we will soon begin the process of redistricting as we are required to do. And we do that using federal census information. And so getting the count right is important, again, nationally, but also internally within our state borders to make sure that we get fair legislative districts. And that is a critical element of our democracy. And so that's another reason that it's important. And I would point out, Heather, the form is relatively simple. It's not burdensome to fill out. And I'd also point out that the information does not get shared with other federal agencies. It is used by the Census Bureau. And so if folks have concerns about confidentiality, which I certainly understand, those concerns should be addressed by the fact that there is no information sharing with census information.
Well, anything else you want to catch us up with here before the Labor Day weekend?
So the only other thing I wanted to mention, Heather, is that the Registry of Motor Vehicles has announced that it's going to do special service hours for those over 75 years old. And so the Danvers office is going to be hosting those hours, and I want to make sure I get this right. So they're going to start on Wednesday, September 2nd, so it has begun, and folks can either call or go online. You have to have an appointment for those hours, but that's a very significant development. And the second piece of news that's relative to the Registry of Motor Vehicles, and this has been going on for a while, but I wanted to remind folks of it, is that if you had been thinking about getting a real ID, it is very difficult to do that now because you have to, a real ID has to be obtained in person. And so what the registry is doing to take pressure off the in-person visits to the branch locations is saying that if you renew your license and subsequently you want to upgrade to a real ID, then that fee will be waived so that you can get your license, make sure it's current, and then after the fact, 6 months after the state of emergency ends, you can apply for a real ID and there won't be an additional charge for that. All of the details are on mass.gov on the Registry of Motor Vehicles page, but it is important because a lot of folks are trying to make the transition to the real ID, and we want to make sure that they know that by renewing their license right now online to get it done, you are not forfeiting your ability to get the real ID without additional cost. I hope we have a wonderful weekend. I hope everybody gets to get outside and be outdoors and get some recreation in, because we know that this has been a stressful period of time, and recreation and leisure activity is really important, not only for our physical health, but also for our mental health.
Exactly. Well, you take care. Thank you.
You too. Thank you, Heather.